When Edward Lloyd, the first of his name, arrived in Talbot County, Maryland in 1660 as part of the original Virginian colonizers, he built the Wye House Plantation as its geographic center, with immediate access to the Wye River, Chesapeake Bay, and the larger Atlantic world. He erected his house near the cove that cuts into the property, emphasizing his attention as a tobacco merchant to trade through waterway access. He migrated from Wales and established his family estate on the eastern shore of Maryland, complete with the formal gardens that displayed his knowledge of plant cultivation and the trends of European-inspired designs. We know this through recorded history, and the plantation today is largely held up as an example of Georgian planning and a nostalgic reminder of colonial times. Landscapes, however, are experienced in a multiplicity of ways. Until the mid-19th century, there were really only two main groups of individuals living on the plantation: free whites and enslaved blacks, who viewed and moved through the grounds in distinctly different ways. We'll use the Wye House Plantation and another Chesapeake landscape, William Paca's garden in Annapolis, as examples. To go beyond the traditional historical interpretations of Euro-American formal plantation gardens and landscapes, we look to recognize the contributions of more than just the plantation elite in shaping gardening practices. Beyond a Eurocentric view of colonizing powers as the shapers of the landscape, this alternate perspective understands the multiple ways in which landscape may be experienced, analyzed, and encoded. This has become a dialogue among scholars, a conversation we want to join and expand. We have begun to apply these ideas to the plantations in the American South, particularly the Chesapeake, and are considering its application to landscape studies elsewhere. One of the most influential works regarding this type of formal garden is Mark Leone's seminal 1984 work on the William Paca Garden in Annapolis, Maryland. Leone uses Marxist concepts of power, hierarchy, domination, and ideology to describe why Paca built his garden and how it functioned. Since then, a large body of literature has been written which approaches these landscapes through the same ideals of the Georgian order, that is, the order of modernity and capitalism. This interpretation to us seems rather intuitive. These gardens are conceived of and built by white, landowning males interested in either maintaining their own power and position in society by naturalizing and masking qualities, or in an attempt to acquire the power position that they do not yet have. Implicit within this ideology are consequences for the arrangement of time and space. While this paradigm has given researchers a powerful way of seeing how these gardens functioned in 18th and 19th century America, it has not been without its critiques. One critic of Leone's early work in the Paca Garden is Ian Hodder. His critique of the explanation Leone gives is that it is a top-down approach that dismisses the possibility of agency for those who are subjected to this garden. He argues that Leone's early use of the dominant ideology model is only a partial understanding of these spaces. He claims that there is an interplay, a negotiation between the dominant and various subversive ideologies that play out through the relationship of material culture. He encourages a skepticism that all visitors would have translated the language of William Paca's garden in the same way that William Paca would have. His point is that it is possible to reject the dominant ideology to varying conscious and active degrees. In response, Leone and myself and Beth Pruitt's current work through Archaeology in Annapolis has been informed by this critique, and we seek to understand when and how groups in the past have been able to see through the dominant ideology as espoused by society's elites. 2 years after Ian Hodder first published his critique, Del Upton published a chapter titled White and Black Landscapes in 18th Century Virginia. In it, he makes it clear that there was no 18th century landscape in colonial America, but at least two. Because racially based slavery was a social reality with profound spatial implications, those of European descent and those of African descent had fundamentally different ways of viewing, inhabiting, and moving about the landscape. Upton concludes that the plantation landscape was designed to be met as a powerful and intense ideological statement, but the African and African American enslaved were not part of this intended audience. As such, landscape was not intended to function as ideology for the enslaved. In its absence, power and violence were the coercive forces that maintained slavery. Freed from this ideological function, Upton's chapter adds an additional dimension to landscape studies, that is, the possible multivocality of landscape. Upton creates a framework with which we can apply Hodder's critique to colonial gardens. Oop, need it too. Part of what has been missing here is the role of the enslaved to shape and form and change the meaning embedded within landscape. Garden historian Barbara Cerruti devotes an entire chapter in her book gardens and gardening in the Chesapeake 1700 to 1805, to the laborers that made these gardens possible. It is our contention that enslaved gardeners bring their expertise and ideologies onto the plantation landscape and enact them upon the gardens and elsewhere. It is well established that a significant portion of the labor required to build and maintain these gardens came from those of African descent, who brought with them their own expertise. As the slave ships brought plants and humans to the New World, the enslaved brought an understanding of the useful medicinal properties of those botanicals and a successful implementation of various gardening techniques. These plants' expertise and the ability to adapt the flora of a new environment provided nourishment, medicine, and spiritual well-being. They were also the means of a resistance and a reversal of power relations. These gardens were certainly a place on the landscape occupied by the enslaved, who, as both Hodder and Upton reminded us, would have applied their own cultural logic to interpret and understand them. When freed from colonial interpretations of these spaces, and with the combination of multiple perspectives, the garden becomes a place of otherness. Michel Foucault calls this a heterotopia, Homi Bhabha calls it the third space, and Henry Lafargue calls it a representational space. They all describe a theoretical conception of space in which there is an active process of identity formation and social ordering. Kevin Hetherington in Badlands of Modernity maintained that these spaces also become a stage for the renegotiation of order, where alternate social orders manifest. There's also a large and growing literature that acknowledges the diasporic nature of African gardening practices and ordering due to the Atlantic slave trade, especially in the context of the United States. Since the 1980s, Posanski has called for a more global approach to African American archaeology, explaining it as a detriment to the field to ignore the growing body of West African material cultural literature when studying the roots of African American practices. In the investigation of modern-day African American gardening culture, researchers have begun to look to West Africa and other nations in the African diaspora, not that West Africa is a nation, for the cultural antecedents of particular yard and garden designs. Drawing from Robert Ferris Thompson's The Flash of the Spirit, African and Afro-American Art and Philosophy, material culturalists find themes in these gardens such as motion, containment, and flash, manifesting in the form of found objects, such as wheels and tires, bottles and boundaries, mirrors and light bulbs. Within plantation spaces, some slaves were permitted to keep gardens, or did so anyway outside of the plantation house, and it is thought that through these gardening practices, aspects of African traditions developed into a uniquely African American gardening tradition that is continuation in some gardens today. So drawing from this understanding of garden spaces, the spiritual practices of the African diaspora reveal patterns in the ways in which plants and metals were used for medicine and ritual, which suggest alternate interpretations for the material landscape. Particular plants, though chosen by the slave-owning elite for the qualities that make them exotic or aesthetically pleasing, may hold entirely different meanings for the enslaved laborers. Ase, the metaphysical controller of the spiritual world, manifests itself with particular qualities in physical objects. The classification of plants and the natural world, as used in medicine and spiritual practices, is dependent on things like smell, color, texture, interaction with humans in terms of the effect humans have on the plants, as well as the other way around. Additionally, because the taxonomic structure of plants within Yoruba practices are based on physical attributes, which makes them divine, it has been suggested that the enslaved could have functionally substituted plants and herbs in their ritual, despite not necessarily being the same plants found in Africa. Robert Vokes, in a study of Yoruba magic and medicine in colonial Brazil, found that many of the same plant families, and therefore plant morphologies, existed on both sides of the Atlantic. Vokes concluded that the physical elements necessary to continue such practices would not have been difficult to find within a new American landscape. The ordering of plants by the Linnaean system of classification, popular in the scientific gardening of the era of colonial America, is thereby joined by a different mode of categorization and ordering. Although there were strict restrictions on place and movement through the landscape, the interaction, physically, mentally, and spiritually, with nature and materials created a landscape of resistance for the slaves. Descriptions of this landscape are not found overtly in historical records, and it is the realm of archaeology that can illuminate this aspect of the plantation.